we are in the condition we are in the state of ignorance we are in the state of war, in the state of economic depression, in the state of depletion of the resources of our planet because of the greed of psychopaths who thought they could create their own reality. Well, look at the reality they created.
You're listening to Sott Talk Radio, the world for people who think.
Hi, and welcome to Sott Talk Radio. This week, we're going biblical, but with a strong revisionist bent. The idea that a man called Jesus Christ, born of a virgin, performer of miracles, betrayed and crucified and declared to be the Son of God, actually existed during the Roman Empire in the area of modern-day Palestine is the subject of long and often heated debate. Historians and archaeologists are adamant that there is no historical evidence for the existence of such a person. Christians, on the other hand, just know in their hearts that Jesus lived and died to take away their sins, or debts, as the case may be. So what's the deal? Well, as you're going to find out, the skinny is that while it isn't exactly widely known, to say the least, that there is evidence to suggest that the details of the life of Jesus Christ were in fact pinched from another famous JC of the same era. So seriously, who's on first here? Joining me this week are the usual suspects, Jason, Neil, and Pierre, and also author and historian Laura Knight-Yachik. So Laura, getting back to that kind of general question there, seriously, who's on first here?
Aha. Well, you've asked a question that
kind of is going to be answered later on.
Well, yeah, because I think I would rather describe how I came to the idea and then found some confirmation. And describing how I got to the idea is going to take a little bit of time, but I can assure you it's pretty interesting, so it's not going to be boring. But what I also had planned to do tonight was talk about a few other things, including one of my own recent little discoveries during the course of doing the research for the next volume of Secret History. And it all kind of ties in together. But even before that, I want to tell everybody some things about history, the practice of history, how history is done, how it's been done, and some of the things that we're up against when we try to read sources about history or historians interpreting those sources. Obviously, everything that happens around us on a daily basis in the political sphere and the social sphere is history in the making. If you think about it, the old saying, the victors write the history, is never more true than when it's being written as you experience it or live it or observe it on a daily basis, assuming you're paying attention. For example, what will historians of the future have to say about the assassination of John Kennedy, for example? There is the official version, and then there are all of the works by alternative historians, or what they call conspiracy theorists, and I'm going to say something about that in a second, that completely contradict the official version. What will survive in the future? And this is kind of the dilemma that we're looking at here in any discussion about Jesus or any other famous person in history. What if, in the future, the powers that be decide that it's very, very anti-political, or it's anti-stability of the society for any of these books about the assassination of John Kennedy being a conspiracy by the government to continue to exist? And they launch a campaign for house-to-house searches, library searches, have people turn each other in for possessing such books, and they eliminate all of the books about any other idea concerning the assassination of John Kennedy other than the established authoritarian position. What then will future historians have to work with? That's an interesting question, isn't it? The same could be said about the events on 9/11/2001. Suppose at some point it's decided that conspiracy theorists are stirring up the population against their constituted authorities, and all of the individuals who do not buy into the party line or have written books or articles or whatnot are rounded up, gotten rid of, or made to swear some kind of oath of allegiance, and their books are searched out, burned, destroyed. What then will future historians say about the events of 9/11? The fact is that those kinds of things appear to have happened in the past regarding our real history, and I'm going to show you a piece of evidence that I have found that this is the case.
Just a quick note. This rewriting of history according to the victors is obvious when we think about the example you gave. It works right now in real time in a uniformitarian world. Imagine that in between you have major disruptions that destroy most of the witness, most of the books, most of the old tradition. This way, rewriting is even more easily performed.
But there's even worse, because, I mean, of course, when we're talking about this, what are historians going to think 2,000 years from now about 9/11? Books, without a lot of care, they don't have a very long life. I mean, paper can tend to rot, get damp, or whatever it is, and colors fade, ink fades, anything. So someone would have to really, really work hard to preserve a book across that amount of time. The way that texts in the past have survived is that people copied them to new parchments and new scrolls and new books. And these people obviously sometimes got really bored with whatever a person was saying and then tried to summarize it. So, I mean, again, there's that. Like, how will people summarize the assassination of JFK?
And what about copying errors?
And copying errors.
Translation errors.
What about translation, evolution of language?
Yeah, all of these things come into play in the transmission of history. So we are faced with revision as it happens, revision after the fact, destruction that is unplanned and unforeseen, destruction that is deliberate, and, of course, if you have a discontinuity in history, such as a period of extreme stress on the planet when the population is greatly reduced, institutions fail, infrastructure fails, the death rate is like 80 to 90%. These events have happened in the last 2,000 years, by the way. And then you have very few people left who are literate, and the ones who are left are basically free to do what they wish with whatever manuscripts are available. So those are all the problems that face the historian. But
I was going to say something there, which was just that it wouldn't be so bad that that kind of thing happened, particularly the destruction, kind of unforeseen destruction, cosmic catastrophe or cataclysms or whatever, if all of the lies and twistings that went on at the time were wiped out with the with the cataclysm, or with, you know what I mean. But the real problem is that somehow
the lies persist.
Yeah, today we're basing a lot of our history and a lot of our beliefs and values and all that kind of stuff, and our religion comes from 2,000 years ago. That includes all of that revision and changes at the time and all that kind of stuff, and most likely a cataclysm or two along the way. But still, we're saddled with it.
Yeah, and we're convinced, or some of us are convinced that it's true. Well, let me present my two particular examples here. One of them is another person's discovery. The second one is my own discovery. The first one is what is called the Edward II conspiracy. Now, you probably wonder why I'm bringing up Edward II when we're going to be talking about Jesus ultimately, but bear with me, this is important. I hope that most of you know the story of Edward II, but just in case you don't, I'm going to give you a little quick recap.
Of England.
Yeah, Edward II, King of England. I grew up knowing the story of Edward II because the account of how he died was so horrible, it would give anybody a nightmare. He was King of England from 1307 until he was deposed by his wife, Isabella, in 1327. Isabella was the daughter of the King of France, and she was called the She-Wolf because after she went off to France where her brother was king and hooked up with Roger de Mortimer, Edward's sworn enemy, who was one of the few people in history who ever escaped from the Tower of London, by the way. Together they got help from continental nobles, assembled a small army, went back to England, and took over. They did this with almost unanimous support of the people, so obviously at the time Isabella and Mortimer were not seen as predators or wolves. The next thing they did was they put Edward himself, since they were not quite willing to take the step of committing regicide. That would have been a very bad thing, and it would have set a very bad precedent, and it probably would have excited the people against them because it would have been considered a sacrilege because the king's person was holy. So they didn't kill him. They put him into custody with some people who were supposed to watch him. He was imprisoned. He had style and comfort, but somewhere along the way, he was allegedly killed. How was he killed, and why does this thing stick in my mind? Well, since he was pretty much a flaming homosexual, the people claimed that he had been killed in a particularly horrendous way that was supposed to be suited to his proclivities. He was killed by having a hot poker, red hot, that had been heated in the fire, inserted into his anus and stirred around so that all of his innards would be basically cooked while he was alive. The story said that his screams could be heard all over the countryside. And that's the short version. So a few years later, Isabella and Edward's son, who was the nominal king, who was being guided, and I have that in quotes, by Isabella and Mortimer, was feeling a little bit hostile that his mother's lover had killed his father. Go figure. He got some friends together, and they snuck into the castle through an underground passage and confronted Roger de Mortimer, took him prisoner, tried him for murder, treason, whatever, and he, too, died a most horrible death. On that one, you can just think William Wallace in the movie Braveheart. Wallace, by the way, was murdered by Edward I, the father of Edward II, and the grandfather of Edward III, so they were keeping the family traditions alive there. Of course, I knew that Edward II was, at the very least, bisexual, even though he and Isabella had several children together. His male friends, his lovers, Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, scandalized the country and took over the government. This is one of the reasons that the people were not terribly unhappy when Isabella and de Mortimer came and took over. He allowed his lovers to dominate him and use him to enrich themselves at the expense of the entire country. So the two lovers actually come across as complete rapacious psychopaths, with Edward himself being kind of an innocent victim of his proclivities, which, was not really a sin as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, knowing all of that doesn't make the way Edward died right. And this was actually kind of the key to the puzzle, if you really think about it, the fact that he was accused of having been murdered this way, or that Roger de Mortimer was accused of having this done, and that these stories were spread around, and it was these stories that prompted his son to gather his friends to go in and arrest Mortimer and try him for treason and execute him in that horrible way. So that sounds like, the story. That's history, right? Everybody's been teaching that story for, basically since, the 14th century. That's history for 600 years. Guess what? It's not true.
Oh, it was a fairy story?
It was a fairy story.
Pretty gruesome one, but yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty horrible. And it's only been discovered in recent years that it wasn't true.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the two different types of historiography come into play. There's the historians who write history because they go and interview witnesses and they read other people's histories and write histories based on those histories. And then there's what they call an antiquarian. Antiquarians dig stuff up, go around, take tracings off monuments, collect local lore and stories, legends, myths. They go and they collect coins, they examine coins, they go into archives, and some people get really obsessed. There was one guy, a pretty famous historian of the antiquarian variety, who spent every summer of his vacation teaching at a big university in the U.S. in the archives, in the court archives in London, studying financial transactions. And the fact is that it was one of these antiquarian types who solved this interesting little mystery. It seems that there was a letter written by an unimpeachable source, the Italian Bishop of Vercelli, stating that Edward II actually was helped to escape, went to Italy, became a hermit, and lived the rest of his life in exile. This is called the Fieschi letter. It was discovered in 1878 in Montpellier, France, by a French archivist in an official register dating before 1368. Now, it didn't get a lot of attention until just recently, but it was discovered that far back. The letter has been tested, and it is not a forgery. The letter contains accurate details that few people knew at the time and was written long before the accepted accounts of the murder were penned by the propagandists who were out to get Mortimer. Historian Ian Mortimer, who, by the way, is no relation to Roger, following the financial accounts and administrative documents of the reign of Edward III, he's one of these antiquarian-type historians, demonstrates in a book rather effectively and convincingly that Edward III probably did receive this letter and that he met with his father in Germany later, this, of course, being after he had executed Mortimer for the supposed murder. And this was the background to certain changes in his behavior and attitude. Edward II, obviously, was content for his son to be king, probably because he knew that the whole country had turned against him because of his, quote, vile, unquote, sexual proclivities and his tendency to want to be dominated in any relationship, which is what had resulted in the almost complete collapse of the royal administration while Gaveston and Despenser were ruling. He also probably realized, and this is just my opinion, he could pursue his urges more discreetly and with less opposition as a private person under the guise of a hermit, that is, in a religious institution.
Best place for him. I mean, you're welcome through the doors these days.
It was important at the time for Edward III to protect the reputation of his mother, Isabella, who, after Mortimer's execution, nearly lost her mind based on the royal records of the exchequer, because the payments to various types of doctors and so forth and for her care in her confinement were listed in the books. Nobody had a clue for over 600 years. What is remarkable about this is the fact that this letter was found and the truth revealed it all. How much more of our history is exactly like this, concealed, covered up, and the truth never comes out at all. Of course, some old school historians who really believe in the mainstream history that we've been listening to for 600 years criticize this conclusion stringently, and they criticize Ian Mortimer's methods because, he's there digging through the records of who was spending what money in the court and what it was being spent for, which is kind of how he found it, that Edward III had spent some money on this trip to Germany, that he had paid some money to this unknown person who it apparently turns out was his father under an assumed name, who had come to spend time with him in Germany before going back to his Italian monkly cell. Anyway, if you want to know the details, you can read Ian Mortimer's book, The Greatest Traitor, as well as Alison Weir's book, Isabella, She-Wolf of France, Queen of England. And I think after you read these books, you'll agree that it's time to put a period to that terrible story and acknowledge that people in power do a lot of things that the rest of us don't know about without certain accidents of fate, such as the discovery of the Feshki letter. We have no way whatsoever of knowing what is truth and what is lies. The point of this story is that when studying history, everything can appear on the surface to follow a fairly logical cause-event process, and the history can be powerfully influenced by the propaganda of the times, such as including the story of the horrible murder of Edward II as possibly true. That puts Isabella and Mortimer in a particular light, which it seems obvious now they did not deserve to have cast on them.
But served the purposes.
It served the agenda of the time. It also makes it obvious that even the peoples of the time, or the times, can be influenced by propaganda to act in certain ways that they later learn were not appropriate. Undoubtedly, Edward III, exposed to the horrible rumors about the death of his father, got worked up to the point that he was willing to cause grave psychological damage to his mother and destroy her happiness by arresting her beloved and having him executed. Now, I'm not defending Isabella and Mortimer because both of them had access to grind in the situation, but the shadow of this event spread over the entire period, and it is difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff when one already has an opinion of how bad they were because they were responsible for such a horrifying act against the person of the lawful king. Isabella and Mortimer obviously did save England from the ravages of the Despensers, and who knows how history might have played out if the two of them had continued to rule for a bit longer before Edward III came of age. Things may not actually have been that different, except that a truly awful crime against an innocent Mortimer would not have been committed. But then, perhaps the later realization of the fact that he had, in fact, executed an innocent man, a man loved by his mother, affected Edward III in a positive way, making him more thoughtful and willing to wait for more data before making decisions. Maybe his realization of his mistake made him a better man and a better king. So when we research history, we have to pay close attention because there are not just two sides to a story. Sometimes there is a truth that hides behind all the smoke and mirrors, and when we come across odd questions, dangling threads that make us aware that something isn't right, we need to sit up and take notice. Which leads me to my own little discovery.
Yes?
Yes. And this is going to be a little bit of a recitation of my research. Those of you who've read the last volume of Secret History, Comets and the Horns of Moses, I hope you've read it. If you haven't, maybe some of the things I'm going to say isn't going to make a lot of sense. But the fact is I was merrily going along writing, more or less a chronology of the history of the collapse of the Roman Empire, which is actually much later than what I ended up talking about in that book, because I wanted to set the collapse of Rome up as the model, and I wanted to cover it fairly quickly, because it was going to be the model of the collapse of the Egyptian Empire, which is where we were going to find Moses. So half the book was going to be the collapse of Rome, and the other half was going to be Moses. And it was going to be one book, and that was going to be it. as some of you know, things just haven't turned out that way, and that's because I had the experience of finding some of those odd questions dangling as I was going through the research. And the first question came along. I had written about Constantine and his experience with what was probably a cometary body that caused him to convert the empire to Christianity. And this was just prior, by
300?
No, I'm talking about how many years before the collapse. So that was in
It's about
312.
less than 200.
Less than 200 years before everything really went there. So Christianity was kind of like in place and growing and manifesting all over the place when everything went kaflooey and
just to point out, it heralded the collapse of the Roman Empire. So apparently God couldn't save them.
For some reference, he was talking about the timeline roughly for the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, circa 590 AD.
Yeah, so the thing was, there I was going along through this chronology, and what I was trying to do was I was trying to find what the chroniclers of the time had to say about anything, and because it seemed to me that Christianity was a religion that grew up and replaced the old ways at a time of climate and environmental collapse, which appears to have been the same thing that was happening during the 18th dynasty in Egypt. Everyone knows, I guess, that around 1600 BC, the volcano Terra erupted and blew basically the Mediterranean civilization to bits, along with other things that were going on. It's a little harder to find out exactly what happened then if you don't have a model. But anyhow, there was a change of religion at that time, too. So it seemed to me that when there's environmental stress, when there is cometary activity in the sky, people start thinking about God, and it's very easy to change religions, and in a certain sense, it's kind of like what happened on 9/11. I don't want to beat the dead horse here, but, there was something that happened kind of in the sky, caused a whole lot of stress for a lot of people thanks to the efforts of the mainstream media, and everybody was converted to the belief that 19 Arab terrorists, guided by some poor guy on a dialysis machine in a cave in Afghanistan or Tora Bora, wherever the heck he was, overcame the defenses of the greatest nation on earth. I mean, that's kind of a pretty wild belief, don't you think?
Sounds
well, anyway,
ridiculous when you put it that way.
Yeah. So the thing is that there I was going along, and I was looking at these things, and then I thought I'm just going to back up just a little bit, and, I'm just going to make this really complete. So I was looking at all of the historians of the period, and there's quite a list of them, quite a list of chronicles of the period prior to and more or less during the collapse. For example, there's Zechariah Rhetor, who wrote from 465 to 553. John Malalas, 491, 578. Cassiodorus, 485, 585. John Lydas, John Malalas, Procopius of Caesarea, Jordanes, John of Ephesus, Pseudo-Zechariah, Theophanes of Byzantium, Agathias, Evagrius Scholasticus, and Menander Protector. The Chronicon Paschal, which was kind of like a compilation of all of the other historians, was put out, between 600 and 627. Then there's the Zuckman Chronicle, which came out, so probably no later than 775. It, too, is a compilation of all these previous historians. There's Dionysius of Telmare, 818 to 845. These are getting late, but they are chroniclers who compiled from the ancient historians. Constantine Porphyrogenitus, who was, by the way, the Roman emperor. And then there's a book called the Suda, which has excerpts and little synopses of all the manuscripts that Porphyrogenitus had in the library. And then there's Michael the Syrian, who was much, much later, but he preserved some excerpts that none of the others preserved. Now, all of these chroniclers belong to the Western or the Eastern Empire, Constantinople, because, of course, after Constantine had his vision and after he had certain experiences in Rome, he decided to go live in Constantinople. That's how this history is told. One wonders, of course, if he decided to go live in Constantinople because this cometary impact that, by the way, has been more or less confirmed for the northern part of Italy at the time, made the weather or the environment in Italy a little less salubrious than one might have wished. In other words, were things falling apart, things going haywire already when Constantine moved the capital of the empire. Yeah, we have the history that we're told, but as we've just seen from the history of Edward the Second, it's not always so cut and dry. There's a lot of things that get changed around. But in any event, you want to say something, Pierre?
No, just wanted to bring some discussion, and so it's.
I don't want discussion. I want to talk.
To bring some life in the account.
Okay.
So we give some variety and
bring
more
some
life
in the account.
And one strange tendency among those chroniclers, Roman chroniclers, is that they tended to all stop their activity around year.
Yeah, well, just wait till I get to that. Just wait till I get to that. You're just back off, buddy.
I'm going to be quiet now.
Is there any chance
you're going to give it all away? I got to get the build up here. Okay. So anyway, as I said, all of these historians, Pierre is allowed to have a little bit of leeway here because he's done all the translations for me from Michael the Syrian. Apparently, Michael the Syrian does not exist in English, so you have to get it. And of course, none of us speak Syrian, ancient Syrian, or Old Syrian, so we have to refer to a French translation of the Old Syrian, which he then translates into English for me so I can see what Michael the Syrian had to say. But in any event, what happened was I was searching through all of these historians, their works, which I had to obtain, by hand, reading each one, and I was entering in the data in a table, year by year. When an event came up, I would enter it in with, I had like a table with one column for the year, and then the rest was a cell where I put the information in. Basically a chronicle sort of arrangement.
And here you were listing cataclysm.
What I was looking for were evidences, bits of evidence for what was going on in the environment in particular. I wasn't interested so much in political events, though in some cases I was including them because it struck me that really outrageous political events, might have been inspired by the atmospheric or environmental events. So I was listing, and I'll give you an idea of the kinds of things because I have a little list here. For example, in the 7th year of King blah, 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 on the 8th of the year, blah, 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 torrential downpours in the month of January, flashes of lightning, heavy claps of thunder. Streams which run into the latter were so swollen they rose above flood level. The river, lights in the skies. Some said they saw the heavens aflame. The whole sky seemed to catch fire. There appeared at midnight a multitude of rays. Portents appeared. Rays of light were seen in the northern sky. Flashes of light. Blood rained from a cloud, falling on the clothes of a number of people. Portents, homes of people, vessels were discovered inscribed with unknown characters. 2 centers of light, objects of brilliance. The walls of the city collapsed. The portents appeared a second time this year. An earthquake. People suffered from a terrible epidemic. Great numbers of them carried off. Whole series of malignant diseases. Serious outbreak of plague. I'm just flipping through this, but this is the kind of stuff. A sound as of trees crashing to the ground was heard throughout the whole region, but it can hardly have been a tree, for it was audible for 50 miles. Rays of light towards the north again. Terrible storm battered down the vines and crops. The city was burned by a great conflagration. 2 islands in the sea were consumed by fire which fell from the sky. They burned for 7 whole days. Villages were burned by fire sent from heaven. It took so swift a hold that homesteads and threshing floors were still spread out, reduced to ashes. That sort of thing. So you see what I was looking for. Now, historians of these ancient chronicles have, up to this very day, considered those kinds of things as hyperbole. They will say that there was a religious battle taking place, and each side was using this kind of ammunition against the other. The pagans were saying there was a fire. They would write that there was a fire from heaven, and the church was destroyed, and that's proof that the Christians are bad. And then the Christians would write, well, there was an earthquake and the city was destroyed, and that's proof that the pagans are bad, or that, God is testing us to see if we can stay faithful, and so on and so forth. So the historians tend to say that these kind of things are either exaggerated, made up, misinterpreted, or what they're using metaphors like God smote the city. Instead of the historian, the chronicler, actually meaning that the city got smitten in some way.
He didn't know how, and so attributed it to God.
Yeah, he just attributed it to God, or that it could have been an economic collapse, and that was God smiting the city. I mean, they actually will argue these kinds of points. But I was taking this slightly different approach. I was going to accept these kinds of things as data to work with, which is why I was collecting it and entering it in my table.
And there were very good reasons to take it as objective facts, because sometimes you have the account of the same event from 2 independent sources. They don't know each other, and they tell the same story. B, you have archaeological evidence, in some cases, of major disruption. And C, those very same chroniclers that are accused of exaggerating actual events, meanwhile, they were giving very accurate, detailed, and objective account of political life.
Which the historians do use when it's
they believe that, but then exclude the other. And there's another factor. How many did you have? You had 3 there? Okay, number 4 is the fact that Victor Klube, Mike Bailey, the other Bailey, and several astronomers have determined that there have been periods of very active cometary flux in and around our planet, with many impacts and or overhead explosions. And there are many, many other astronomers who are collecting evidence that proves that this is the case. Impacts of the Tunguska type, only bigger and meaner. Impacts of the type that struck Russia in February of this year, only bigger and meaner. And I hope that everybody has watched the videos on that one, which curiously occurred 3 days after the release of my last volume, Comets and the Hordes of Moses,
which you can get on Amazon.
Do we want to hear it?
Format Kindle. Yeah, I think we should hear the arrow of Zeus.
Okay, we're going to hear the thunderbolts of Zeus. This is what those people were hearing, only way worse.
Minus the dog.
It keeps going.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing. Now imagine that you lived 2,000 years ago, or even like 1,500 years ago. You have no experience of the concept of a missile. You see this bright thing streaming across the sky. There's some videos of it where there's like this streamer. You see explosions
You hear that.
Bright flashes. You know that it's not lightning. That didn't sound like lightning or thunder. You know that the flashes aren't anything like that. There's no rain clouds or anything like that. What are you going to ascribe that to? You don't know about missiles. You don't know about bombs or anything like this. You're going to call it what? The thunderbolt of Zeus, the wrath of God. And if it destroys some building near you, what else could you say? I mean, something came down for which you have no concept of and blew up a building or set fire to everything. I mean, what else are you going to say?
I would, depending on how regular those kind of things were, you would kind of have hoped that after a few occasions that they would realize that they're rocks falling from the sky, at least for a while, and someone smart enough to say, listen, this is rocks falling from the sky from whatever source.
Actually, there was one who did say that, and it was the teacher of Socrates back in, 380, wasn't it 380 BC or whatever?
Yeah, but of course the potential.
And he was either put to death or driven to suicide or something because he said rocks fall from the sky, and then there was one that buried a city at Egespotami, and I may have the date wrong, so y'all don't hold me to dates here.
Of course, the potential for that to be spun into, the wrath of God is obviously very, very present.
But look at how the government today uses the fear of terrorists, right? Would the individuals at that time, some opportunistic priestly castes or anyone would want to use the fear it caused to make some sort of changes or reforms? I mean, would they capitalize on it and therefore encourage the interpretation, it's the wrath of God because you believe in so-and-so and we're not in power?
Especially
in other words, your God, our God is red hot, your God ain't diddly squat.
Well, especially if God had been associated, or was associated for a long time with the emperor or the king or the ruling elite. I mean, this is not just God's wrath, but my wrath, I mean, it can be co-opted
at this
in many
time,
ways.
They were not totally naive about what was happening in the sky in 580. These Chinese had established a classification of comets, about a dozen different kind of comets. Between 540 and 590 AD, chroniclers
But comets were different from things that entered the atmosphere and exploded. See,
could they not be if a comet was seen and then?
That often happened. Fragments. A comet was seen and then fragments came, and of course, the comet was a god.
Yeah, so there is specific mention of comets, and but for 12 times between 540 and 590. But wrath of God, it may be a naive take on what's going on in the sky. It may be also the awareness of what we call the mandate of heaven that we mentioned previously. At this time, there was a deep sense that political affairs and cosmic events were correlated. Michael the Syrian, in his chronicles, present the pages of his book the following way. He has two paragraphs, left column, right column. And on the left column, he has the cosmic events, the natural phenomenon, and on the right, he has the political events. He keeps drawing correlation between political behavior, in particular abuses committed by the leaders, and catastrophes.
So what you're saying
God's wrath is not necessarily a naive take on it. It might be an understanding that there is a correlation.
Exactly.
God is unhappy.
Yeah.
Or the universe.
That they're not mutually exclusive.
Which is why Michael the Syrian hasn't been translated into English.
But look at right now. I mean, there's been a rash of disasters all over the world. Flooding and crop failures and all this different stuff, and these sort of signs and portents.
And the government...
And what is the government doing right now?
The authorities, they're trying to cast all of that activity onto more natural... for example,
humans.
Chemtrails, global warming, it's all humans' fault. It's either humans doing chemtrails that's changing the weather and causing these things, or they're doing geoengineering causing earthquakes. The government is in control.
Well, it's kind of
Let
like
me
exactly
ask you this question.
It's kind of exactly the opposite of what was going on then. Today when these kind of things are happening, they are and probably will try to ascribe it all to either human causes, whereas in the past it was all celestial and heavenly, divine causes.
What would Michael the Syrian write about what was it? It was a 2-mile wide tornado ripping through and destroying houses, and what would he say about what was
and look at the political events that were going on at the same time. Look at the political events that are going on at the same time that any of the events that the planetary
events,
And just one of the fundamental differences between now, the cover-up now, and the take on it in the 6th century AD is that there has been a major paradigm shift. The cosmogony is different, and in the past there were probably
science
in this field closer to truth than we are now, with the advance of scientism, uniformitarianism, mechanistic universe, clockwork model of the universe where human activity is totally decorrelated from cosmic events. It opens the door to the cover-up we are hearing now, where all those manifestations of fundamental cosmic change are covered up as man-made, unrelated, harmless events.
Yeah.
And it's just the opposite. It's related, it's cosmically induced, and it's not harmless at all.
So the problem there is you could think that in the past, people not knowing the real source, let's say that they were comets or they were rocks falling from the sky, is kind of primitive. But actually, probably people back then were better off in a way than we are today in the current system, because at least then, if they believed that rocks falling from the sky was somehow associated with corrupt leadership and they got rid of the king on the basis of that, at least there was a chance for some people power and some positive change to be affected. But today, nobody's going to blame the government for anything that's going on, even if that is the real cause, if there is some correlation between the corruption going on today and cosmic catastrophe or brewing cosmic catastrophe. No one's going to go and cut off the head of whoever or attack the elite on the basis of that. So we're actually in a worse position than people back then.
Nobody's blaming now. I think we might reach a point where the cover-up will be difficult to maintain because human beings, despite all this indoctrination, will realize they are facing events that are major, that are harmful, that are dangerous, and that have such a magnitude that it's not man-made, and therefore it cannot be man-controlled.
Yeah.
And when that happens,
the king is naked.
The king is naked.
I don't know.
Okay, so speaking of that, let's go and look at some of the things that I compiled from my collection of chroniclers. There was quite a little list of them. Now, remember, this is the Eastern Roman Empire. Remember that, like in 410 A.D., supposedly the barbarians came along and invaded the Western Roman Empire. They sacked Rome, and that was kind of almost the last you hear about anything going on in the Western Empire. Not entirely the last, but for all intents and purposes, as far as the empire is concerned, that was kind of the last. So essentially, there was 100 years from the time of Constantine and his comet until you hear nothing further from the Western Empire. It basically has collapsed, and the only thing that's really left going on is the Eastern Empire, where the new capital of Rome has been moved by Constantine, and the Roman emperors continue to exist, although they're no longer in Rome. So here is what the chroniclers, and these are really short versions, really short. I'm not even going to describe all of the details, just, hit the high spots. In the year 431, there was comet, grasshoppers, earthquake the 7th of April and the 6th of July. Fire fell on Constantinople. 450 to 457, there's an earthquake in Tripoli. 457, Constantinople again. Fire and ash fell from the sky. There was a huge earthquake at Cyzicus. 474, an earthquake in Thrace. 491, eclipse of the sun, plague of grasshoppers. 498, earthquake. Nicopolis, springs of a barn stopped flowing. The river Euphrates stopped its flow on the same day. An earthquake. Nicopolis was destroyed. A plague of grasshoppers. Fire on the north side of the sky. 500, eclipse. Ash falling from the sky. The walls of Edessa collapsed. November, there were signs in the sky. January, signs in the sky. 501, famine, locust, plague. 502, earthquake. Ptolemais, Tyre, and Sidon, fire in the northern quarter of the sky. Earthquake in Neo Caesarea. 503, there was a sign like a spear visible in the sky. 504, an earthquake in Rhodes. 505, there was a massive killing of people, not explained, in Persian territory. 518, on the 9th of July, a comet, a great spear in the sky. 521, Dyrrhachium, the wrath of God fell. That's all it said. But that's pretty suggestive.
Sounds pretty impressive.
In 522, Anazarbos, calamity from the wrath of God. Another wrath of God. 524, Edessa was flooded, and this was reported by John Malala, Pseudo-Zacharias, Zuckman, Procopius, and Michael the Syrian. 521 was the Great Antioch earthquake. 528, Antioch earthquake, 29th of November, so there was another one. 529, Amasia in Pontus, wrath of God fell.
Can I make one small point
Yeah.
about this? I mean, this is not like they had the internet, where you can read about it. Oh, there was like a 2.5 earthquake in such and such a place. Just imagine how big such a thing would have had to been, that somebody would have had to travel over to some other place and say, oh, by the way, there was an earthquake, and it would have been really big news. So it's not like we're talking like, 2.1
These are
earthquake.
city-destroying earthquakes, by the way. I told you that I'm just giving you the short version. These were city-destroying earthquakes, nation-destroying plagues of grasshoppers, city-destroying floods.
This information got to these people because of the people who were fleeing the area, the survivors, basically.
In 529, the wrath of God fell. There was an earthquake in Corinth. The Euphrates was obstructed. There was a flood. In 530, there was a great star in the western region. 531, Anazarbos, again, the metropolis of Cilicia, overthrown, its fourth collapse. It was specified in the Chronicle that it was the fourth time it had been destroyed in a fairly short period of time. 532, there was the Nike Rebellion under the reign of Justinian, and there was a great shower of stars reported. There was an earthquake in Constantinople and an earthquake in Antioch. In 535, there was the biggest volcanic eruption of the Holocene era, according to David Key. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case, because he was citing the Chinese Chronicle, which reported that there was a strange double roll of thunder in February coming from the southwest. Okay, coming from the southwest would be in the direction of, since it's coming from China, just imagine the direction. He also says that there was an eruption of Krakatoa at this time, which he derives from an eyewitness account from a medieval manuscript. There is tree ring evidence from Siberia indicating that this year began a 10-year period of the worst climate conditions experienced for almost 2,000 years. The year 536. The sun seems to have lost its light and appears of a bluish color for almost a whole year. In China, they reported the stars were lost from view for 3 months. A failure of bread in the year 536.
So there was a lot of stuff.
There was a lot of stuff, yeah. And this comes from the Annals of Ulster, the Annals of Innisfallen, Michael the Syrian, the anonymous Syriac chronicler, the Zuckman Chronicle, John Lidos writing from Constantinople, and Michael the Syrian extracting from John of Ephesus. And, of course, I found that there was a drought in Peru which affected the mochi culture. And then the pestilence began, according to Procopius. Yes?
We're getting there.
Yeah, we're getting there.
It's growing up, we're getting there.
I mean, we've actually bypassed
50 years to go.
We've bypassed
in 537, just 1 year after, and it could have been the same year, because sometimes these years are just a little bit iffy. The Battle of Camlan, according to Mike Bailey, this was a mythical representation of comets in the sky and cometary bombardment. There was also a drought in Mecca, according to the 8th and 9th century Arab historians. In 538, Pompeiopolis, there was an earthquake. In the 11th year of Justinian, a great and terrible comet appeared. The Great Beirut earthquake and tsunami occurred in the same year. 539, comet, famine, Vesuvius, Antioch earthquake. 540, cometary bombardment, according to the Chinese historical records. Gildas reports cometary bombardment up in the northern regions of the UK. There was a collapse of the Great Dam of Marib in Yemen, in the country of Sheba. So that was an interesting year, 540. 541, the plague began in Egypt. There was a comet in Gaul. Earthquake occurred in Kyzikos. There was a comet, there was drought, earthquake, blah, blah, blah. So I'm getting this from all these different chroniclers. In 542, the sun appeared at noonday. Plague began in the east. 543, plague in Mesopotamia. 544, plague in Italy, southern France, Spain. 545, plague in Persia. Famine, plague, Mesopotamia. 546. 547, tremendous thunder and lightning. 549, flood in Cilicia. Plague in the British territories, according to the Bishop of Llandaff. 551, another Beirut earthquake and tsunami. Earthquake over the Middle East, the sea retreats, John Malalas. 553, earthquake, terrible thunder and lightning, from Chronicle of Theophanes. 554, earthquake in Constantinople, the destruction of Baalbek. That's interesting. Wait till you read the next book and hear about Baalbek. That's very, very interesting. 555, there's another earthquake in Constantinople and plague. 556, famine, Constantinople, plague, ashes fell from the sky. 557, more plague, earthquakes, Constantinople. 558, Constantinople, plague. 559, fire in the harbor, plague and earthquake, Cilicia and Antioch. 562, drought in Constantinople.
Yeah, but when you say plague, like in Constantinople, the plague was so bad that they were paying people in gold to get rid of the bodies.
Well, yeah, like I said, I'm hitting the high spots of these things, but each one of these events was absolutely freaking horrendous.
So decimated
the death rate in Constantinople was said to have been something like 70 to 80% of the population.
Hundreds of thousands of
all of that happened. You just covered about, what, 200 years there?
We started in the year 431, and we are right now at the year 565. We're barely 100 years.
So 100-some years, and they were the 100 years that were kind of leading up to the fall of the Roman Empire, but historians say that the Roman Empire fell because
barbarians
and overextended armies and stuff like that, and they ignore all of this massive upheaval and say, yeah, you think that might have had something to do with it?
Plague after plague, famine, pestilence.
So let me finish here. Now, 565, there was another comet. 566, another comet. 570, an earthquake between Edessa and Samosata. Plague and famine in Yemen. Bombardment of stones from the sky. 574, earthquake. 577, famine and cometary bombardment. And then guess what?
Nothing.
The records go silent. Even though...
Because the records got hit by a comet.
Even though it is said that several of these chroniclers lived past this event. Now, notice we're at 577... And we've got John Malalas lived to 578, Cassiodorus lived to 585, John Lytus lived to 565, John Procopius lived to 565, Jordanus 560, John of Ephesus 588, Pseudo-Zechariah at least to 588, Agathias 582. Agathias experienced the plague himself, lost most of his family. Evagrius Scholasticus, 593. Menander Protector, 582. So, did all of these people just stop writing? No, they didn't. What we are told is that their chronicles cease. And it just happens to be that they all kind of cease in the same 3, 4, 5, maybe 10-year period.
Yeah, around 580.
577.
Yeah. The chroniclers, all those chroniclers stop chronicling, and at the same time, a new chronicler.
Well, you just back off here, Pierre. Just back off here, because we gotta introduce this problem.
Yeah, we
properly.
Can we get the Cliff Notes?
Yeah, no, you're not going to get the Cliff Notes. I am not going to be thwarted. Okay. In any event, the Chronicle picks up in 591. Eclipse of the sun, violent earthquake, plague in Constantinople, blazing drought, aphid, small parasitic insects, plague on the land, solar eclipse, drought, blah, blah, blah. So we have from 577 to 591. And I was thinking, well, things must have been peaceful finally, thank God. Everything quieted down.
14 years gap.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, well, hallelujah. They were all having a good time then. Everything was,
hunky-dory.
Hunky-dory. And then, must have been over. Everything was over. So then I had this brilliant idea. Well, I had read Gregory of Tours many years ago. It's a very entertaining book. I highly recommend it. You'll laugh out loud.
Mm-hmm.
And I remembered that he wrote about some odd atmospheric and climatological things that kind of stuck in my head because I thought to myself, well, that's a peculiar thing to describe, because this was years before I was even involved in any of this kind of research. But I remembered it. So I said, okay, so there is a Western chronicler who survived. I wonder if he observed any of the same things that the Eastern chroniclers observed. Did he observe them maybe from a different perspective? After all, he's over there. He's in Tours, and they're over here. But things are supposedly happening way up in the sky. If I could get another witness for some of these events who saw the same things, basically I'm looking for an independent witness, then that would say that the historians are wrong when they say that these were hyperbole or metaphors, because here's Gregory of Tours seeing the same thing over there from his perspective on the other side of the empire. This was my plan. So I was going to go through Gregory of Tours and extract all of the same kind of information. Now, naturally, since I had been creating this table as I went along year by year, I had all these cells, I would put the year in, and then I would write the event down. And if I came to an event that belonged in a year that I had already covered, I would scroll back up and put it in the proper year. And if I came across an event that I hadn't yet had an event for that year yet, I would, do a create new cell or create new row and enter it in. So it was just basically using kind of like a column table. So now what I proposed to do was to divide my descriptive column in two, and I was going to have the Eastern chroniclers in one column and the Western chronicle, which was Gregory of Tours basically, in the right-hand column. And then, of course, there was going to be this little tiny column all along the left side that gave the year of the event. Now, interestingly, I was in the process of doing income taxes at this particular moment in time. And income taxes, as you know, involves columns of numbers. And you have income on one side and you have outgo on the other side. And interestingly enough, I was also being audited by the French fisc, who were accusing me of money laundering or getting money from strange places or, doing all kinds of weird things, asking me, where's my yacht, where are my jewels, my furs, my Ferrari, all that kind of stuff, which was really totally ridiculous. So I started thinking about, and they would ask me for proof of where our funds came from, and I would take them the bank records and say, here's the bank records, it shows everything that comes in and goes out, and what goes out, kind of equals what comes in. Sometimes it's a little more than what comes in, so we're kind of on the edge of being broke, but there's nothing weird going on here. And I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, I know that there are people who do that kind of thing, and I was trying to figure out how they did it. If somebody was trying to conceal money, how in the world would they do it? I mean, it didn't seem to me to be possible because, you have money that comes in and then you have money that goes out. But still, that question was kind of in my mind at the time. And I started with my Gregory of Tours project, and I believed that I was going to have to do a few row entries, that there were going to be matching or overlapping or intermixing entries in my database. Now, I want you to draw right now, if you've got a piece of paper and a pencil, draw on this piece of paper and pencil a square box divided into 3 columns, a little skinny one on the left for the years, and then imagine that, there's all these different rows with events listed in them, and there are the first, how many years did we have? There's like maybe 50 or 60 rows where there are entries in the left column. Not the year column, but in the left column of the Eastern Empire. And then on the right column, we're going to put Gregory of Tours. Okay? So, like I said, I figured I was going to have to make entries. But I also figured I was going to be able to find matching events where I didn't have to enter a year. But then, you know what happened? When I got to 577, when all of the Eastern chroniclers' works were lost, this is what we're told. Their works were lost. The last part of the chronicle didn't survive. We assume he was still alive until this year, but there doesn't appear to be any further writing. He breaks off in mid-sentence, so he must have died. These are the various explanations given for why all of these chronicles cease. And what I started doing was add row, add row, add row, add row, add row. Because remember, I'd stopped at 577, and then the next row began with 591. So I add row, add row, add row, add row, add row, until guess what? I had completely filled in the gap. That is, on the right-hand column, where Gregory of Tours' entries were being entered, it had completely filled in the gap between 577 and 591. That means that there was now a big empty space in my left-hand column where the chroniclers had stopped writing and then started writing again. And on the right-hand column, where Gregory of Tours was, there was his first entry to his last entry, which first entry began where the left-hand column ended, and his last entry ended where the next column in the left, or the next entry in the left column began. And I sat there and I looked at that. And I got this really funny feeling because, of course, I was thinking, well, if you had books that record monetary transactions and you find that kind of gap in a bank record, that everything is going along, blah, 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 and then all of a sudden money is no longer appearing for a certain period of time, and then if you were, say, a FISC agent or an IRS person or some kind of forensic accountant, and you found a bank account that had money going into it that exactly fit into that gap of the first bank account, you would say, okay, somebody is moving money, they're hiding money, they're transferring money. Because I was thinking about it in terms of accounting. And in other words, it's like, where's the money? And there's the money. Somebody has transferred something from somewhere else to another account. And I saw Gregory of Tours as being an account. And all of these other chronicles were an account. And somebody had moved stuff completely from the Eastern Chronicles into Gregory of Tours, and that's where it was. Well, that gave me a really funny feeling because, you don't expect to find something like that when you're searching through history. And the only reason I found it was because of the specific types of information I was looking for. Because certainly there were chronicle accounts of other events, political, religious, etc., from other sources that overlapped or that had been created later. For example, our later sources from after 600, 700, they kind of filled in the history of those gap years with religious and political events. So this happened, the church at Ephesus, the bishop this, there was a martyr, they had a synod, they agreed on rules, the emperor did this, the emperor did that, so on and so forth, but not a single freaking environmental or celestial event in that whole gap period. And then Gregory of Tours, the period of time that he covers just happens to have exactly all the way through these environmental and celestial events. So I said to myself, something is very funny about this picture. So I wrote to a famous historian who is a university professor in the United States. I believe he's at Harvard. I'm not going to give his name. And I said, look at this table. Tell me what you think. And he wrote back to me the next day, and he said, I see the problem. I don't know what to tell you. Good luck.
He's probably come across many things like that, and that's his attitude. Like most historians, it's like, well...
I doubt that he's ever come across anything like that.
Well...
Because nobody,
nothing is blatant.
I don't think anybody has ever seen so blatant a piece of evidence of the manipulation of historical material, because that is what it is. Somebody took material from the chronicles that they claimed did not exist or had ended, destroyed the copies, and put that material into Gregory of Tours. Now, what does that say about Gregory of Tours? Was Gregory of Tours real?
Yeah. Well, the question is, why not just destroy it? Why move it and leave it in place?
Well, I think the reason was, first of all, Gregory of Tours was the historian of the Franks, supposedly.
Mm-hmm.
And Gregory of Tours was supposed to give them a sort of legitimacy. And his chronicle was supposed to be kind of a legitimate one. It was supposed to be written back during this time, this particular period of time when all of these things were going on. And in order to make it look like other chronicles of the time or similar, the events were taken from these other chronicles and scattered through his. They were given to the right year,
yeah,
but they were scattered through there because they didn't want his chronicle to seem different from the other kinds of
or
chronicles.
to have a gap.
Yeah.
It's better to have something going on than nothing going on, right?
Yeah, because all the while, like I said, they've got the other chronicles filled in with religious events, political events, this kind of thing, and then they've, similar things. They've got other things that other chronicles written where supposedly absolutely nothing unusual was going on. This person was writing letters, he was having dinners, he was doing this, he was doing that, and nothing unusual was going on at all. But the fact that this collection of events, specifically weather-related, flood-related, earthquake, and most of all, fire in the sky, and fire from heaven, destruction of cities, and so forth, was given to Gregory of Tours, moved to France when it probably never happened in France that way, because probably by that time everybody was already dead.
Yeah, it was a major forgery in the sense that concerning the late Roman Empire, the only source available in the Western Empire is Gregory of Tours. So all the legitimacy drawn by the Carolingian, the Franks, the new dynasty, Charlemagne, and so forth, the sole source of legitimacy, giving the missing link between the Franks, the Carolingian, and the Roman emperors, was Gregory of Tours. So he played a pivotal political role in the establishment of the ruling dynasty that were going to
they took over
lead Western Europe for centuries.
Kind of legitimizing their history.
Exactly. And their root, their origin.
Yeah. And basically they hooked up with the, by marriage, with the Empire of Constantinople, and they created a new pope, put him down in Rome, pretty much gave themselves total, complete legitimacy based on the work of Gregory of Tours.
And probably this, well, we're getting really off topic here, but probably this rewriting, the creation of this new history, legitimizing the Franks and the Carolingian, was made a few centuries after recovery from this major cataclysm that occurred at the end of the 6th century AD. And the rewriting, the pockets of survivors, developing a history that suits their agenda, probably occurred around 800, 900. So it means for something like at least 2 centuries in what was left from the Western Empire, there was no sign of civilization. It was merely survival.
Yeah, it was
for the lucky survivors, for the few survivors.
Stone Age, I mean, at least. And, of course, according to the official story, Gregory of Tours was a historian. He was a bishop of Tours. He lived during the 6th century A.D. He was the only chronicler in the Western Roman Empire for the critical time, the end of the 6th century. So it's not an exaggeration to say that all other historians have based their narratives of the Western Empire on this single source. And the problem is, besides what I discovered by searching for and putting all of the environmental and cosmic events into a table, there are other people who found problems with Gregory of Tours. You're grinning over there. What's funny?
No, carry on.
Are we getting messages from the listeners?
Well, someone named J.H. Christ sent a message saying, my child, I thought this show was to be about me. Get on with it, or my Father who art in heaven shall smote thee good.
J.H. Christ, believe me, we're getting there.
We're an hour and 20 minutes into there, and I don't think we've mentioned Caesar or Jesus once.
Well,
this is the preface. Okay,
we may have to do this in 2 shows because the information is so important.
Mm-hmm.
But in any event, I'm going to be writing about some of the different people who have found problems with Gregory of Tours. For example, the names of towns, bridges that didn't exist or did exist or should have existed, the use of the word patriarch and so forth. There is a sufficient number of bits of evidence that Gregory of Tours, who gave the Carolingians legitimacy and who then gave legitimacy to the Pope at Rome, which then imposed Christianity on the whole Western world, was based on a huge freaking fraud.
Yeah, and the discrepancy that are found in Gregory of Tours writing, the use of words, description of places, buildings, events, suggest strongly that Gregory of Tours writings were probably written around the 11th century AD.
Which is, where a suspiciously large number of manuscripts start at.
It's probably coincide with the time when Western Europe we started to develop, and you had those abbeys, those monks that started to write an history that was highly favorable to their agenda, i.e. legitimizing Christianity, Catholicism, and linking them to St. Peter and to Rome. And
it also coincided with the return of a favorable climate. This was the medieval warm period.
Yeah. So what is striking is that all the Eastern Empire alleged eyewitness accounts dry up completely right at 578 AD, the time that John Malalas is supposed to have died, and do not pick up again until 591. However, if John of Ephesus lived until 588 and was writing his own accounts of events at that time, and we suspect that those events include astronomical, atmospheric, and climatic records in which he was obviously furiously interested by the rest of his chronicle, what happened to those accounts? So, that was those were the two things that framed my research as I was going along. And then I came to a most interesting thing, a story. I backed up and I discovered that the predecessor of Constantine had been an initiate of the Mithraic mysteries, and so were all his fellow emperors. And I started thinking, wait a minute. He was into the Mithraic mysteries. He came out of retirement. This is Diocletian, or Diocletian, as it's more correctly pronounced. Came out of retirement to try to straighten out the mess that Constantine was making. And he went to some place a little bit south of modern-day Austria, and he and his fellow co-emperors made a sacrifice to Mithras and left an altar with their names and the time and the purpose engraved on it, which is now in a museum in Vienna. And I said to myself, wait a minute, what's going on here? Because this guy, Diocletian, is a very interesting guy. I'm not going to go into details about that, but this is the thread that I started pulling on that led me to Caesar, interestingly enough, because I said, Mithraic mysteries. I started looking into the Mithraic mysteries. And what I wanted to know, first of all, was where did they originate? Where did it come from? And it seems that what we know about them comes from Plutarch, where he says, the power of the pirates had its seat in Cilicia, and at the outset it was venturesome and elusive. But it took on confidence and boldness during the Mithridatic War because it lent itself to the king's service. So he goes on and on and on, talks about these pirates and how they had flutes and stringed instruments and drinking bouts along every coast, seizures of persons in high command, ransoming of captured cities, piratical craft, which were not merely furnished for their peculiar work with sturdy crews, but they had extravagant gilded sails, purple awnings, and silvered oars, as if they rioted in their iniquity and plumed themselves upon it. So he goes on, and how the power extended over the whole of the Mediterranean Sea. And I'm going through my notes here. And then Pompey was designated as the person to get rid of the pirates. So the reason we know that the pirates were the first mention of the mysteries of Mithras is because Plutarch tells us so. And he said that they had forts and strong citadels in the Taurus Mountains, and so on and so forth. So I thought this was really strange that pirates that were put in order by Pompey were described in these terms. Because if you then go and read Plutarch's description of Julius Caesar, or his history or story of Julius Caesar, and then his stories of Mark Antony, you will discover that the stories of these revels and flutes and music and actors and silvered oars and purple awnings and golden sails and all this kind of stuff are the exact same words that he uses word for word to describe the activities of Caesar and Mark Antony in relation to Cleopatra, curiously. And then you also find that all of this stuff goes on in Cilicia, which is what got me going on, what else was going on in Cilicia. And that's what led me to the study of Stoicism, which was included in the last volume. And it was
mention something important.
What?
That Caesar was kidnapped by Cilician pirates.
Yes, Caesar also was kidnapped by Cilician pirates while he was on his way to Rhodes to study rhetoric, at the same time that the great Stoic philosopher Posidonius was in residence and teaching there. Also, it is said that Pompey knew Posidonius. So, you guys messed me up, actually, because I've got to explain how this comes about, because I had to study Mithraism. And it was in the study of Mithraism that I came across the fact that Mithraism was pretty much something that was reserved for men, and it was spread by the Roman armies, because everywhere the Roman armies had camps, there were Mithraeum.
And even their structure, the structure of the societies, were along the lines of Roman military structure, or so some people say.
Yeah. So what happened was, the people who study the Mithraic mysteries finally came out with the idea that the figures, the Mithraic mysteries, instead of having Jesus on the cross or some mandala or something as their central feature, have what's called a tauroctony. It's a scene where a man who is dressed in a very specific way is killing a bull that has several specific symbols on it. And these symbols are always the same in every Mithraeum. So along came a guy, a German scholar named K.B. Stark, and said that the figures in the tauroctony, which is this scene, represented not characters out of Iranian mythology, but rather a series of stars and constellations. The Mithraic tauroctony was not a pictorial representation of an Iranian myth, as Cumont and his followers claimed it was, but a star map. Stark's theory was based on the simple fact that the figures which accompany Mithras in the tauroctony, the bull, the scorpion, dog, snake, raven, lion, and cup, everyone possesses a parallel among the constellations, in particular a group of constellations which are all visible together at certain moments during the year. The bull is Taurus, the scorpion Scorpio, the dog Canis Major, the snake Hydra, the raven Corvus, the lion Leo, the cup Crater. In addition, the star Spica, the wheat ear, the brightest star in Virgo, parallels the ears of wheat, which are often shown in the tauroctony, growing out of the tip of the bull's tail. These parallels, argued Stark, cannot be coincidental, and the Mithraic tauroctony must have been created in order to represent a group of constellations. So a lot of study goes on, and then somebody comes up with the idea that these represent the constellations along the celestial equator, not the ecliptic. And there are also two figures that are always included in the scenes. There's a man on the one side with a torch up and another guy on the other side with a torch down. So it was figured out that this meant the equinoxes. So in other words, it was a star map that was taken at a certain point in time, because the equinoctial positions can date it. So there's, I'm not going to go into the discussion of the ancient nature of this Mithraic mystery, because there are things in it that relate to comets and so on and so forth. And we have 7 grades of initiation in the Mithraic mysteries. You have one called the Raven, which is ruled by Mercury, one called the Nymphus, which is ruled by Venus, Milas, the soldier, which is ruled by Mars, and they have all symbols: beaker, lamp, veil, diadem, etc., etc. One called the Lion, which is ruled by Jupiter, and finally, skipping through the rest of them, you have one called the Pater, or Father, which is ruled by Saturn. So Plutarch says that the origin of Mithraism was Cilician pirates encountered by the Roman general Pompey in 67 BC. He says that these pirates offered strange rites of their own at Olympus and celebrated there certain secret rites, among which those of Mithras continue to the present time, having been first instituted by them. So how would a bunch of Cilician pirates know anything about astronomy? And that was the question. And I went through, and I'm not going to give you all the details, but the fact is that the person who discovered the precession of the equinoxes and the fact that you can date things was very closely associated with the Stoics. And then as I chronicled in the previous volume of Secret History, you can follow that whole history and see that thread running through there, this idea of precession of the equinoxes, cycles of history, divine fire, cyclical catastrophes related to the behavior of princes or politicians in relation to their people, that's a very strong thread. So that is what I was looking at, and I even found a date because, let me give you the date, because David Ulansey wrote a really interesting book about this, and I would highly recommend his books. So you may want to review the material in the previous volume, Secret History, where I discussed Bailey, Klube, Napier, examination of how the accurate astronomical knowledge of the ancients was degraded and reinterpreted by the various Greek philosophical schools that emerged following the Dark Ages. As I wrote there, the beginning of the Greek civilization began after a period of global stress and disruption due to cometary bombardment that brought the Bronze Age world to an end. And you have to keep in mind that the Taurids are called that because they appear to come from the constellation Taurus. And in some time in the past, what came from that constellation may have been far larger and more dramatic than the meteor streams that in our modern times seem so benign and decorative. 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, the objects emanating from Taurus were not so small and benign. Enormous, brilliant celestial objects would have been seen traveling along the zodiac with attendant fragments looking like a shepherd with his little fluffy sheep. Backtracking still further tells us that the giant comet came tens of thousands of years ago, and its initial appearance may have started the last ice age, et cetera, et cetera. So, in the previous discussion, I followed the line of Greek philosophers, and, following the Ionian school and Anaxagoras, and it was Anaxagoras who claimed that the sun and moon were earthly bodies, and so on and so forth. But anyhow, I brought this study of philosophers down to Posidonius, and it's with Posidonius that we connect with Julius Caesar, and it's with Julius Caesar's army and his conquest of Gaul and his travels up along the Rhine River and into Germany and so on, where you find these Mithraea. In other words, Julius Caesar's soldiers probably were initiates in the Mithraic mysteries, and it's probable even that Julius Caesar himself was a high initiate. And I think I'm going to make some efforts to provide some coincidental, circumstantial evidence that this may have been the case. And I think that the story of Julius Caesar having been captured by these pirates in the way that it's described is just as much a red herring as the story of the pirates described in the exact same terms as Antony and Cleopatra and Caesar and Cleopatra and all of the other individuals, because as it happens, there was a Mithraeum that was discovered fairly recently under the palace of Julius Caesar's heir, Augustus Caesar, in Rome. So there is some pretty strong evidence that this is one of the things that Julius Caesar and his army were into, and one of the things that kept Julius Caesar and his army so tightly bound with one another. And this is, and there are strong hints and indications that if it had not been for Constantine, Mithraism would have been the religion of the empire. And Diocletian, of course, was initiate of Mithraism. And I suspect that the assassination of Julius Caesar and the honoring of Julius Caesar was combined with the Mithraic mysteries and the principles and ideas of the Stoics, and it is from that combination that Christianity emerged. And in fact, so anyway, this is what I came to think, and I started talking about it here in the house. And I said, I feel a little crazy because I started reading all of this stuff about Julius Caesar, and the more I read, the more I realized that the life of Julius Caesar, his life is almost identical, sequentially and in terms of events as the life of the so-called Jesus Christ.
Well, at least the last years.
Well, no, I'm saying even his birth. I mean, we've got this handy little book that some research was done that shows that probably Julius Caesar was born at a place called Bovilla, not exactly in Rome, and Bovilla is like the place of the ox. At the very least, it is the place where his family origins were located. So, and then at a certain point in time, when he started his civil war, Julius Caesar replaced the standards of his army with images of the bull. He got rid of the Roman eagle and he put the bull up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And along his life, he sacrificed bulls several times. He wrote a book about astronomy as well. Even during his funerals, the way his body was cremated is quite peculiar. There was this big...
No, I don't know. Just wait. We're going to do the funeral. We're going to do the funeral.
In terms of, I could give you a broad overview of Julius Caesar's life in 5 sentences.
Okay.
Of what he, what you could sum it up as.
Give us the overview.
He's a great and just man who astounds his age by instituting a comprehensive policy of forgiveness. On the verge of becoming the king, he is betrayed and murdered by those he had saved. The treachery epitomized by his turncoat friend. When his tribulation begins, his close friend and religious deputy, sworn to protect him, flees in fear and disguises himself. The murdered man's ultimate triumph is being resurrected as a god. And then his betrayer commits suicide. That's the general outline of Caesar's life. And hang on a minute. I've heard that before.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
And
where is that?
The whole structure of the life. You have... we don't talk about Jesus or Caesar specifically, but imagine a character, a human being, that is born from a very famous lineage, but born in a poor family, who starts a quest to defy the ruling elites, to reduce oppression, to serve people, who perform miraculous deeds, who will be betrayed, who will be killed, and who will resurrect. The structure of the life of Jesus Christ follow this script, but also, which is not so well known, the structure of the life of Julius Caesar exactly follow this path. Because one of the problems is... Go ahead.
Yeah. That's why I just read out, basically,
One of the problems of official history is that it depicts Julius Caesar as a bloody despot, as someone who killed millions and millions of people, someone who spent his life waging war. But actually, when you look at the details of the life of Julius Caesar, you realize that the main value he defended all along his life and the sole objective he was pursuing all along his life was to establish a new world where people would be treated justly, and the values he was serving were, above all, about his own life. It was honor and mercy, systematically.
Clementia
Caesar.
I mean, on the opening page of Suetonius's biography of the 12 Caesars or whatever it is, the first thing he says about Caesar is his refusal to divorce Cornelia at the request of Sulla. He defies Sulla, who he hates anyway because Sulla, has killed and murdered all these people. Sulla was the dictator that everyone claimed that Caesar was, obviously, and him fleeing and hiding in caves to escape him. And that's how the story of Caesar starts. It's like one of the first things that you learn about Caesar is when he's probably about 18 at this point or something, 18, 19.
He's 18.
He's 18 at this point. From that time on, this is where we get the story, and it's one story of him, one story after another, of him resisting the established authorities, the dictators of the time, the corrupt aristocracy. I mean, people, when they talk about the Roman Senate, it's not like a Senate today. Back then, it was basically
An
aristocrats.
oligarchy.
It was an oligarchy of aristocrats. They were all noble.
I beg to differ about it being different from today, but
It was actually exactly like it is today.
Well, no, I mean, these people were all descended from noble families, and their right to rule and their position in the Senate was dictated pretty much by the fact that they were patrician families, that they were, these sort of noble people.
I think the big difference between Caesar's time and today is not really the Senate. That is quite the same, but just today there's no more Caesar. But this being said, what is difficult to reconcile is that how Caesar, who killed million people from his own account, he says so. How can he be this model of mercy? And to understand that, we have to understand the context and what happened before Caesar. And until Caesar, all winners had all the rights on the one who had lost, and they were exercising systematically this right. It means the one who lost were being killed, raped, tortured, including the warriors, the children, the family, the wives. Everything was destroyed. And for the first time in history, you had a man with tremendous power, tremendous legions, who showed mercy again and again and again.
In every single case.
And most of the time, he was being betrayed, and in some cases, even showed mercy twice. He was betrayed, and he showed mercy again to the one who had already betrayed him. It was a revolution, really.
It was a total philosophical and even somewhat spiritual revolution with Caesar. And the Gallic Wars did not take place in a vacuum. It wasn't like he walked into Gaul, everything was completely hunky-dory, people were just flapping around, throwing flowers around, free love everywhere, and he just started cutting people up. That's not what happened. That's not what Gaul was like at that time. So this whole he killed 1 million people, he went in there, and in almost every single engagement and every single time, he said, don't do that. And then they did it. And then he said, if you do that, I'm going to stop you. And he always gave them a chance to surrender. And then when he had won, if they surrendered, he showed them clemency. And most of the time it was like, don't do it again. And then they would get together again and do it. So it wasn't this. It didn't take place in a vacuum. So that's one thing that people say. Oh, he killed 1 million people in this gigantic campaign, but that wasn't taking place in a vacuum.
Well, let me just say that as I went deeper into the study of Julius Caesar, looking for any kind of evidence that he could possibly have been an initiate of the mysteries of Mithras, I came across the book of Stefan Weinstock called Divus Julius. And it's there where he chronicles the life of Julius Caesar with the epigraphic, numismatic, and monumental evidence.
Numismatic meaning coins.
Yeah, that gave me the realization that the life, from the time he crossed the Rubicon until he had his triumphal entry into Rome, every single thing he did, and even including his birth and his upbringing and his introduction of the concepts of mercy and so on and so forth, just reminded me of I kept thinking, my God, that sounds like Jesus Christ. And when the author, Stefan Weinstock, when he talks about how when Caesar was approaching Rome, how all of the people came out from all the countryside and all the towns and villages, and they lined the way that he was traveling, and they threw flowers at him and branches in the roadway. Hail Caesar, hail Caesar, hail Caesar. It was just like the whole triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. And, of course, we all know that, just a few days after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, Jesus was brought up on trial and supposedly crucified and betrayed and crucified. Well, it took a little longer for Caesar, but there were other things involved there. But anyway, Weinstock makes a remark. He says, well, there is other precedent for this type of event, this triumphal entry. And it's Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Well, supposedly Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem that followed this same model was like, 60 years or almost 100 years later.
And that's not a precedent. It came afterwards.
Yeah, it came after.
So the answer to our question at the beginning of the show, although we're not going to finish here necessarily, but the answer to our question at the beginning of the show, who was on first? Well, the historical record shows that Caesar was on first.
He was always first.
All you need to, he was officially first.
Everything that was supposedly assigned to Jesus as, in philosophical terms or whatever, Caesar did it first.
So people aren't. Well, the problem is that people aren't aware of these details of Caesar's life. They've been kind of whitewashed or overlooked, and they're not being.
And if you
really
watch movies about Caesar, I mean, they depict him like some kind of power-mad, ambitious. And the thing was, if you read carefully and you read the sources, you see. And remember, all the sources writing about Caesar were hostile sources. Mm-hmm. They were members of the ruling elite, the oligarchy, and he came in and messed up their sandbox and took their toys away. Gave land to the soldiers, gave land to the poor people. In his will, he left a bequest to every single resident of Rome, for crying all night.
300 sesterces.
Yeah, so
each citizen.
Anyway, it started making me feel a little crazy to be thinking this. Jesus Christ with Caesar. And I started talking about it a little bit, and I started, reading the excerpts and saying, that's just like Jesus. That's just like Jesus. And I would bring him down. I could come down to breakfast with my latest research, and I'd say, this is just freaking me out. It's freaking me out completely because it was not something that I ever expected to find. And then I talked about it a little bit when we were traveling a month or so ago with some members of our research forum, and even at that point, I was still feeling a little crazy. I was just kind of trying it out to see, does this sound all that crazy? And then it was, not too long ago that Pierre decided to see if anybody else had ever thought of this. So he put some kind of text in Google and searched, and he discovered this interesting guy, Francesco Carrata. Well, Francesco Carrata has the whole thing worked out, and he's, as far as I'm concerned, with his evidence based on how the texts were morphed and how they changed over time, it's clear that the gospel stories, at least the earliest gospel story, the book of Mark, is about Julius Caesar. And it's clear how the text emendations were made, or the copying errors, or the changes, or how they used abbreviations and so forth. And maybe Pierre wants to give us a quick rundown on that, because I felt a little less crazy to know that I wasn't the first person who had thought of this.
Yeah, basically Carrata compared mostly the first gospel, Mark, to the life of Julius Caesar. And he discovered that for not some point, not most of the point, but for every point, the structure, the requisite, i.e. the content, and in most cases the name, were the same. Apart from concerning the name, apart from some translation mistakes. Just one example. The beginning of the journey of Caesar, quitting Ravenna and marching towards Rome to bring peace, marching towards the Senate, or in parallel, Jesus from Nazareth and crossing the Jordan, etc. Beginning of their journey. So on one side you have Julius Caesar. On the other side you have Jesus Christ. Julius was called Pontifex Maximus. He was a high priest. But in Greek it's Arches Megistos, Kreis Istos, Christos. So you have Julius Caesar, Jesus Christos. They both come from a land, Ravenna, Nazarea, a city, a town. From a land, Gallia, Gaul, in Latin, for Caesar, Galilea, for Jesus Christ. They both cross a river, the Rubicon, the Red River, and the Jordan that goes in the Red Sea. They both go to a land, Ionia, Italy in Latin, and Judea, Judea. They both reach a first town, Curfinum for Caesar, Capharnaum for Jesus. Okay, there are about 700 pages in this book now, 500 pages, and there are all the points, basically, all the miracles, all the characters, all the structure are so similar that it cannot be due to coincidence. Basically, the Bible and the New Testament, the Gospels, are a very close adaptation, inspired or copied from Julius Caesar's life
But don't think that the similarities are just those. I mean, like
no.
Oh, there's many more.
Thousands.
The problem is that anybody just looking at it objectively, you have all of this historical evidence for Julius Caesar, his life, the details of his life, what he did, and he did it first. And then you have this person called Jesus Christ, for whom there is no historical evidence, and no evidence that he did any of the things, but all the things that he did exactly mirror, or very closely mirror, what Julius Caesar is known to have done.
And so you have this situation.
And not only that, but the details in the Gospels of Jesus' life are all completely contradictory and make no sense whatsoever. So just look at it from that point of view and you say, well, the second one that came along afterwards has got to be just a made-up piece of bullshit that somebody copied from the life of Julius Caesar that we know actually happened.
Well, the thing is what I think happened is when because for me the most profoundly moving part of the story of Julius Caesar is the story of his funeral, which is, as it turns out, the exact model on which the so-called Passion of Christ has been created.
Mm-hmm.
It follows exactly. I mean, even to the wax image of Julius being raised up on a cross-like object so that all of the people who are listening to Mark Antony's funeral oration can see it, and him holding up Caesar's robe at the point of a spear so that they can see the robe he was wearing when he was assassinated with all of the holes and the blood on it,
Here maybe we can add a detail, because most biographies, most stories about Caesar relate his story from his birth, or from when he was about 18 years old, to his death. And you too, Brutus, the assassination. And after, there's less sources. But if you read the sources that deal with the funeral of Caesar, you discover that Caesar was killed, all the Senate flew away, ran away, then the body was carried by 3 servants to his wife, Calpurnia. Then there was a ceremony that was organized in the forum, and during this ceremony, there was a cross that was raised and called a tropeum. And on this cross, you had an effigy, a figure of Caesar, wax figure of Caesar, exhibiting all his wounds, showing what the person, Julius Caesar, who was already considered as a god by the Roman citizen, how he had been killed. So you have a betrayal, Brutus, you have an assassination, and you have a resurrection. You have the same structure, and you have a rebirth, the rebirth of a god.
And not only that, but apparently, according to the contemporaneous account of Virgil, the poet, the signs in the heaven and the events that were supposedly attached to the death of Jesus Christ actually were attached first to the death of Julius Caesar. He writes, "The sun will give you signs. Who dare say the sun is false? He and no other warns us when dark uprisings threaten, when treachery and hidden wars are gathering strength. He and no other was moved to pity Rome on the day that Caesar died, when he veiled his radiance in gloom and darkness, and a godless age feared everlasting night. In this hour, earth also, and the plains of ocean, ill-boding dogs and birds that spell mischief, sent signs which heralded disaster. How oft before our eyes did Etna deluge the fields of the Cyclops with a torrent from her burst furnaces, hurling thereon balls of fire and molten rocks. Germany heard the noise of battle sweep across the sky, and, event without precedent, the Alps rocked with earthquakes. A voice boomed through the silent groves for all to hear, a deafening sound, and phantoms of unearthly pallor were seen in the falling darkness. Horror beyond words. Rivers stood still, the earth gaped open, and the temple's ivory images wept for grief, and beads of sweat covered bronze statues. King of waterways, the Po swept whole forests along in the swirl of his frenzied current, carrying with him over the plain cattle and stalls alike. Nor in that same hour did sinister filaments cease to appear, and ominous entrails, or blood to flow from wells, or our hillside towns to echo all night long with the howl of wolves. Never fell more lightning from a cloudless sky. Never was comet's alarming glare so often seen.
Yeah, and maybe we can mention at this point the Caesar's comet. Caesar was assassinated on the 15th of March. And interestingly, that's on the 15th of March that Jesus Christ, or 15th of Nisan, that Jesus Christ was killed as well, according to the Gospel. So in 44 BC, July, 3 months after the assassination, in July, during the month when Caesar was born, were organized for the first time games in honor of Caesar. And during those games, end of July, between the 20th and the 30th of July, 44 BC, during those games, for 7 days in a row, a comet was seen high in the sky. And this comet is not exaggeration, it's not imagination. It was observed all around the world by Chinese observers in particular. And this comet, the magnitude was -4, that it was as bright as half moon. It was the brightest comet ever observed in recorded history.
Yep.
So there is, all of the elements are there together, and there's another little book that I think is really brilliant. It's called Et tu Judas, Then Fall Jesus by Gary Courtney. It seems that somebody else had the same idea just slightly before. Well, he didn't have the idea before Karada, but he published before Karada, because his book was published first in 1992, and I believe that Karada was still working on his manuscript at that time. In any event, this Gary Courtney has written a brilliant little book. I mean, probably one of the best condensations of the mountains of biblical research that I have read over the years, the authentic work ever seen. I mean, it's really brilliant. He's written it for the lay audience. It's not even a very big book. It's only
162.
Yeah, 162 pages, but he condenses biblical research into that 162 pages and makes the case.
Yeah, you won't be able to read that book and ever believe that the Gospels are anything other than a pure fabrication.
Shoddy fabrication.
Well, the thing is let's be clear. It's not a fabrication, because the story of Jesus is really the story of Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
And there were textual mistakes, translation errors that Karada has documented that show how the transition was made. And my thought is, because of the wild outpouring of grief that fell upon Rome during Caesar's funeral, this tremendous event, this passion play that was staged at the first time when he was actually lying there dead in his on his funeral bier before they cremated his body, that the soldiers of Caesar, the tens and twenties of thousands of soldiers who loved Caesar, who were then at that time and had been for several years, were being resettled all over the empire by being given land and founding towns and colonies, which was Caesar's gift to his army, which was the thing that Caesar had fought for all his life, was to be able to give land to people who deserved it, people who were hardworking, people who fought for the empire, to the poor, the dispossessed. That these soldiers, these people, most of whom were also initiates in the Mithraic mysteries, took the passion of Jesus and turned it into a passion play that they then performed or commemorated every year, or as often as was necessary. Maybe they included it with all of their Mithraic gatherings, all over the empire. And at some point, somebody wrote down the whole sequence, and that became the foundation for the book of Mark. It was a passion play. This explains perfectly, as Gary Courtney points out, this explains perfectly why it is written that way, why it sounds so strange and disjointed, and why there are these leaps. It's because each part of the Gospel of Mark is a scene that's being played in a passion play. And then, over time, then...
Obviously, the original Mithraic enactment of that play would not have been the same as...
No, well...
it was twisted and turned into the Gospels.
Well, kind of.
Well, we don't know that the... Well, what I'm saying is that this is what they were doing. Okay, there was a large contingent of Jews present at the funeral of Caesar, and the historians note, Plutarch and Appian, note that the Jews cried the longest. They came back night after night to the place where the body had been burned, mourning Caesar. And the reason was Caesar had made many laws and had been very kind to the Jews, very benevolent to them, had given them their own rulership, had
made them citizens,
gave them citizenship, exempted them from all kinds of onerous treatment, and basically, I would say that there were many members of his army or of other armies who were Jewish, who were also initiates of the Mithraic mysteries, because you have to understand, a mystery school was more like kind of a man's club, and they had certain other things going on, which I'm going to get into in my next volume. But I think that they used the example of Caesar. They recreated the passion of Caesar, how he was betrayed and died, and used Caesar as their model for behavior. He was not a wimpy guy who just came along and said, "Oh, turn the other cheek," and there's a better world waiting for the meek, and that sort of thing. He was a powerful person who actually did things to right wrongs and make things right for other people. So they were engaged in this activity, and they were engaged in it even in Judea. And I would say that it was this activity, this combination of Mithraic mysteries, some Stoic things, a militant Judaism itself, that turned into the Jewish resistance movement against Rome. And this came about during the Flavian period. And the Flavians then or after the time of the Flavians, then there were additional Gospels that were created and reworked using material from Josephus, twisting and distorting things, adding stuff, adding some philosophy, adding this, adding the other thing. Names were changed. And even the names of the rebel leaders that are mentioned in Josephus' Wars of the Jews become disciples of this Jesus of Nazareth. So the Flavians put the whole set of events back to 30 A.D., gave the individual a name, Jesus Christ, and it's probable that Julius Caesar himself was called Christ in all of these passion plays up to this time anyway, so they were able to slide this in without anybody really noticing anything.
Well, I would point out that there's a precedent. When Romulus was named a god, his name was changed. He was given a different name. They didn't refer to him as Romulus anymore. It was
Quirinus. Yeah, so it was normal for Caesar to be called.
They wouldn't call him Julius Caesar. They would have called him something else.
And what you're saying is that the Jews, then, as the New Testament or the Gospels were written, the Jews who were very who supported Caesar and essentially loved him because of what he had done for them, it was turned around, and it obviously, as it comes down to us today, it's the Jews that called for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ.
Well, the Flavians, of course, turned it around on them because they had this big problem. They had these Judean rebels. They had zealots to Sicarii, et cetera, and these individuals, they had to control them because, they went in there and, destroyed Jerusalem to stop this, because these absolutely, they were being trained by the example of Caesar. Caesar was absolutely, utterly inflexible in his will. He cared nothing for his body. He exposed himself to danger. He never submitted himself to evil authorities. And I think that they were using the example of Julius Caesar in their Christology, in their Passion plays, and that this was the cohesiveness that gave these Judean rebels, their oomph that made them able to launch their rebellion and to stand against the Romans, the later Roman emperors that came after Caesar and after the Julio-Claudian line, ceased to exist. So the Flavians had, or somebody after them had to edit these texts to use them to pacify people, because they could see that if they allowed this worship of Julius Caesar to continue, this was dangerous. This had to be fixed. It had to be edited. This Julius Caesar, this Passion play, everything, he had to be killed on a cross, and he had to be killed by Jews because, of course, they needed to turn the hatred of the empire against the Jews also, because they didn't want them setting an example for other people to rise up against, the controlling rulers of the time.
Absolutely, yeah. An example is a dangerous thing.
And we knew almost nothing about Jesus, but something that was sure is that he was a descendant of David. His Jewish identity was one of the only things that was certain in this new narrative. So basically, you had a very inspiring Julius Caesar cult. It's testified, it's shown in Ephesus, in Antioch, in Alexandria, in Philippi. You have what was called the Caesarea, temples dedicated to Caesar. But actually it was more than that. Caesar was not one more god. Caesar, unlike all the other gods, had his statues in every single temple: Jupiter temple, Diana temple, Venus temple. The level of charisma, of integrity, of honor, of mercy, he showed in his life, and every instant inspired people so much that Caesar created monotheism. And from his death, 44 BC, to around 80 AD, you have the development of this new Caesar cult. It's growing big, and you have nothing about Christianity. And around 80 AD, during the Flavian, Titus, and Vespasian, Domitianus, you suddenly have a sudden end of this huge Julius Caesar cult and the emergence from nothing of the Christian movement. The first mention of Christianity, of Jesus Christ, Nazarene,
that's authentic.
It goes back to the historian of the Flavian, i.e. Josephus. Flavius Josephus is the first one to mention it. And this historian, Josephus, was the official historian of the Flavian. And he started to write. All his work is about legitimizing the Jewish population, and he started writing about this Jesus Christ right after the Jewish wars.
Yeah, but that's because the Jews were demonized.
Yeah,
in the
rehabilitation.
Yeah, and then the first pope, the very first pope, supposedly after Peter, who, by the way, as this other guy, I really don't like this guy. Where's that book?
Atkins.
Atwill.
Atwill.
Where'd Atwill go? We didn't bring it in?
Here it is.
Oh, here's Atwill. Atwill writes a book called Caesar's Messiah, The Roman Conspiracy to Invent Jesus. Well, he's got some points. The guy is a real sick puppy because, he says some things that are absolutely outrageous, but he does notice some things that are very, very damn peculiar, which is correspondences between the gospel stories, particularly between the Gospel of Matthew and the works of Josephus. So it's almost as though either somebody was writing this gospel based on Josephus, or Josephus himself was editing an already existing gospel to make it say what the Flavians wanted it to say. And the whole thing was, of course, you've got to get rid of Julius Caesar. You've got to change the name. You've got to change the location. You've got to change these battles, these miraculous battles that Caesar won by sheer freaking force of will. You've got to change them to miracles. I mean, miracles. And
if weak sauce miracles.
And there's really weak sauce miracles, because if you map Caesar's battles and you map Jesus' miracles along with the travels, you will see that his miracles exactly correspond to Caesar's battles, and in some cases, even the wordplay is identical.
Like obsessus for possessed versus siege.
And there was two major changes I noticed between the Caesar cult and the Gospels. A, the identity of the Messiah, who became Jewish, and B, the paradigm, the way of seeing life. Caesar was promising and implementing a paradise on earth for people. He was serving people. He was doing it, really.
Right.
And he was achieving major success.
Yeah.
That's why he got killed. On the other side, the gospel side, you had the creation of this paradise in heaven that pushed people to accept anything on earth, to actually accept hell on earth, right. Domination, extortion, right. Despotism, to access eventually, possibly, this hypothetical paradise in heaven. So,
in other words, accept the rule of your dominating oligarchy,
yep.
and you'll get to go to heaven if you believe in Jesus. But for God's sakes, do not believe in Julius Caesar and the things that he did, because that will inspire you to rebel.
Well, I don't even think they would have wanted, Caesar wouldn't necessarily have wanted anybody to believe in him in terms of a god. Really. I mean, I would have thought that any lasting
well, of course he would.
testimony he would have said would have been, don't deify me, follow what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, he wasn't follow my example. But I'm just saying that if people believed in the example of Julius Caesar, that a man could, by his will and his righteousness, because Caesar was an extremely righteous man, when he was ordered to divorce his wife, for political reasons, he refused. He went on the run. He was a young man. He was, 18 years old?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He went on the run. Sulla's army was chasing him, hunting him down, and he finally got sick, and he was so sick he couldn't get out of bed, and they found him, and he had to pay them a bribe so they wouldn't kill him.
Yeah, and that's the final treason, actually, because the main meaning, the main message in Caesar's legacy is standing for higher value, the importance of mercy, of honor, of the words you give, of talking the talk, walking the walk. This example, this highly inspiring example, was expurged from all those values and replaced with Jesus Christ as we know, as Christ.
Yeah, just go meekly to your crucifixion, then you'll rise again and go to heaven.
Mm-hmm. Just to understand how awesome this dude was, back in that day, he fought over 300 battles?
302 battles. 302 battles. He lost 2.
And he didn't lose. He had to retreat from 2.
He lost 1 in Dyrrhachium. Yeah. He lost about 900 men. Yeah. And that was a major source of grief. And he lost 1 in Alexandria. It's one of the miracles, actually, where he was swimming for miles, hanging one arm up to save some scrolls, some manuscripts. And so he lost twice. But what we have to keep in mind is that for all the other battles, the 300 other battles he won, most of the time he was outnumbered.
Yep.
So the 300 battles he won,
were miracles.
A lot of them were miracles, but really miracles. It's not about changing water in wine or creating fishes. No, it was. And another stunning thing about Caesar, we've been talking about his moral values. There's also the intellect, this skill, the genius.
Brilliant.
Usually you have genius in one field, You have a genius in painting, you have a genius in music, in engineering. Caesar was a genius in engineering, architecture, creativity, tactics, leadership, psychology, politics, writing, and I forget something because you want to say
rhetoric.
So,
one thing. Julius Caesar invented books, and I am not joking. The man actually invented the book. And I mean, that flabbergasted me. He did all of that stuff, and he had time to invent books. Not that he just wrote them. He invented them and then wrote them.
Yeah.
Well, and actually the Gospels were systematically written on codex.
Yeah.
On books. Why? Though at the time, most of the writings were done on other supports.
And
that's another peculiar coincidence.
Yeah. So Christians really are the people of the book, And it depends on who you see as Christ. And if you really understand that Julius Caesar was Christ, it gives a whole new meaning to being a Christian, and it gives it actually a value that it never had before.
Definitely, we could think that.
The strange thing is that the ideas or the ideology of Julius Caesar is in Christianity, but the kind
watered
of
down.
The militant aspect of it, i.e., impose, if you have to, by force of arms, you need to impose this benevolence and clemency and stuff on the country you live in, and if you see a corrupt elite, you got to get rid of them. So the militant aspect of it, i.e., the people are required to follow the example of Julius Caesar, which was to create as much as possible peace on earth. And if you see it being subverted, corrupted by an elite, you got to do something about it, But that part was taken out of it, and the whole reward was, like Pierre was saying, projected into heaven. Afterwards, just live a quiet, peaceful, good Christian life. A good Christian is someone who doesn't abide corruption amongst the elite.
I hear one thing. I can't remember where I read it, but one of the things that Julius Caesar did was after he got back into Rome after the Civil War, he would host these gigantic, massive feasts, feeding all the people with like 20,000 couches or something like that. I mean, he beats the pants off Jesus with the feeding of the masses.
Yeah, talk about loaves and fishes.
I mean, and there's all these kinds of like parallels between what he did and what Jesus did, but he always did it, to be quite honest, better. I mean, Jesus has a handful of miracles, like kind of like a little bit suspicious. He exorcised some person here, he healed somebody here, got rid of leprosy here. And, Julius Caesar just spent his entire life passing legislation to give massive tracts of land to the poor and disenfranchised.
Feeding people. Making people citizens so they had rights.
Yeah, that was one of the things. When someone would go into Gaul or whatever and conquer, they'd conquer, enslave all the people, take all the booty, where he would go there and then he would, give them autonomy or give them citizenship. And
I just said I used the term that I just made up, impose your benevolence.
Impose your benevolence.
So that sounds very strange to people, but in a certain sense, that's what Caesar did. And if anybody thinks about today, how would you create peace on earth, leaving aside any navel-gazing or imagining or meditating on it? If you were to try to do it in a practical way, and you were in a position of power to be able to do or to try and impose benevolence on the world, like look at around the world, where all of the problems are people not living peaceably together. How would you do that? And what kind of resistance would you come up against by the current elite? And where would that end up? Would you not have to, if you found yourself in that position and had to follow that path and decided it was your mission to follow that path, or you were empowered to do that, do you not imagine you would end up having to go to war against people who, in the
military,
it's a problem. How are you going to do it? People want peace on earth. How are you going to do it in the current context today? How did Caesar try to do it in the context of his day?
And the context of his day was not that much different from today.
So, if you're in a position of power and you're tasked with the job, well, then you either do it or you don't. You either go with what's in front of you or you don't.
And he tried peaceful way. For 15 years, he tried in the Senate to pass laws that were fair, that were smart, that were just. And everybody agrees with that. Cicero, his nemesis, even wrote so. But systematically, the Senate, the optimates, the oligarchy, was refusing his laws. They knew it was good, but they refused it because they knew also it would give him credit in the eyes of the people. Mm-hmm. So after 15 years, trying the peaceful way and making major achievements, they were after him. They wanted to impeach him.
Yeah.
So he saw the only solution to prevent the people from suffering from oligarchy, from despotism, from a new Sulla, from years and years of suffering and death, was to get more political legitimacy in the eyes of the Senate. And from that, he had to get military legitimacy. And that's one of the reasons why he went through those campaigns. There are many other reasons that are very legitimate. That's one of the reasons.
But then he had to go to war against the Senate himself.
After the Civil War.
He knew that Pompey was going to become the next Sulla. Yeah. Like he knew that was the way it was going with Mithridates, the Mithridatic War.
Yeah. What I mean is, I think he realized that he had to go through a lot of death, a lot of battles, in order to prevent much more death and much more suffering, to get the power to create a new world order for the whole empire that will be benevolent.
Oh my God!
Said the
that will
word.
be positive for the people. Yeah, it's
He has
negatively
exposed what we're all about here.
It's negatively connotated, but
Yeah, because
it's a
one of
new
the
world
things-
order, a positive one.
One of the
for
things
once.
that was going on, I mean, the Roman Empire at the time was the Roman and the citizens were crippled by debt, and the
Starvation.
lower classes were impoverished, and the rich people were super rich. I mean, it was
Most were not citizens.
most
They,
most
were
were
they had
like
the
this.
same thing that we have nowadays. They had these vast estates that were owned by the ultra rich that they had gotten because they would go off to the provinces and rape, pillage, and plunder and to steal the stuff from other people, taxes and stuff. Come back, they get all this land. They'd been using the Italian people for years and years to be soldiers, and then they would come back and they would lose their land, and they would be bought up by the rich people, and then of course they would bring back tons of slaves from their conquests to work the land, so that the Italian people didn't have jobs, so they didn't have land, they didn't have jobs. The rich people owned everything. It was the equivalent of the corporatocracy that we live with today. The big corporations, corporate farming, corporate this, corporate that, cutting out, artisans and individual people and family farms, and it was exactly the same thing. And then crushing taxes, and then,
And three of the first laws he managed to get enacted were the agrarian law, where he distributed massive surface of land to families, to poor families. The second law was to grant citizenship to a lot of Roman people who lived in Provence, because for a long time it was only Rome families and Rome people who had the citizenship, who had the rights, who had the privilege.
And only families in the city of Rome with a certain amount of money were allowed to be citizens and have rights.
And the third law was to make consuls, representative of the Roman oligarchy, accountable to stop those abuses that were committed almost systematically by the Roman elite in the province, what Laura described a few minutes ago. So he was really developing, applying a new model, a new, truly social model. And at the core of this model was the respect for people.
And they're right. And the saddest thing is that Cicero is often credited as being some great orator on the topic of freedom and liberty in the Republic, but he was with the optimates and blocking things like that. He was against giving the people citizenship.
He was an officious twerp. He was the most despicable human being I have ever read about in my entire life. And it's unfortunate that most of what we know about Julius Caesar comes through Cicero.
At the same time, it's a blessing.
Yeah.
Since Cicero was an enemy of Caesar, you can be sure that Cicero didn't depict Caesar in a positive light. And despite that, even through Cicero's writing, you can see how exceptional Caesar was. So, from my personal experience, as you might have noticed, I have a slight French accent. So I'm from France, unfortunately, and I come from Gaul, and the Gallic War, to me, it equates 1 million of my ancestors being killed by Caesar. Well, that's a lot. And so I started reading about Caesar with a strong negative bias. And I read and read and read again. And in the end, my conclusion was, this man was, without any doubt, to me, the greatest man that ever lived. That is this simple.
Okay. Well, on that note, we're going to leave it because we've run over a little bit, and that's not a problem. And we may come back to this topic, or we may not. We don't know, depending on if we develop any more thoughts or theories on it. But if not, Laura will be writing about it in the next volume of her series of books. So until then, anybody got anything to say?
I just want to recommend that people read Francesco Carrata's Jesus with Caesar and Gary Courtney's
Et tu Brutus.
Et tu Judas,
then fall Jesus.
Then fall Jesus, yeah. And also there are there's a wonderful book about Caesar Caesar, Politician and Statesman by Matthias Gelser. And then there is, it's going to be hard for you to get Divus Julius by Stefan Weinstock. It's a pricey book, and it's kind of out of print.
But those first three are good enough.
But, yeah, if you get that...
Get the Courtney book first.
Yeah, get the Courtney book.
It's a really good read.
And then there's many other good What's that biography of Caesar that everybody's been reading?
Freeman.
By
Freeman. Philip Freeman?
Julius Caesar.
Julius Caesar by Philip Freeman.
Very good.
Very good book, yeah. I would really encourage people, because if you really want to know, and I believe it is true. I am convinced by the evidence that Julius Caesar was really the Christ, okay?
But not in the way people think.
Not in the way people think. And for me, it's so exciting to be able to have a real biography of a real historical person who was a real example, who really did good things.
Who really turns out to be awesome.
And who really turns out to be, as Pierre says, the greatest man who ever lived. Not only that, but you can even read his own writings. You can read the Gallic Wars. Now, could you imagine basically what I'm saying is you can read the writings of Christ. You can read his own words.
Mm.
You really can. So that's all I wanted to say.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it there then. So until next week, thanks to all our listeners. Sorry to our callers. We weren't taking any calls here. We had a number of calls, but we didn't take any. So